Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, kuku mai, ki tēnei hui. Welcome to this Anti-Racism 2020 event. Ko Jacquie Kidd takuingoa no Ngāpuri ahau. I'll be your chair for this session. He kariki a tātou. Tūtaua mai I runga, tūtaua mai I raro, tūtaua mai I roto, tūtaua mai I waho. Ki tau ai, te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, taiki e. Come forth from above, below, within, and from the environment. Vitality and well-being for all, strengthened in unity. And that's a karakia from Scotty Morrison, particularly relevant to this kind of unsettled situation we all find ourselves in. A little bit of housekeeping just before we start. For interactions, so when you're wanting to engage with people, down the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a little square with Q&A. It's really helpful if you've got questions for our presenters if you use that particular button, because it separates it all out from the chat that's going off down the side all the time. When you're looking at the chat, there's a little drop-down button thing at the bottom that says that who you're chatting to. Please make sure that's set to panelists and attendees so that everybody can see what it is that you're talking about. I'll be acting as your chair and moderator, so I'll do my best to facilitate a really good discussion with these two. And also the session will be recorded and the presentations will be available after the event on the Facebook and Zoom channels. No, it's not Zoom channels. I wrote that down. I didn't mean that. YouTube channels. So now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers, Ruth Souza and Mark Locke, who will be discussing cultural safety, Trans-Tasman reflections, and why cultural safety in governance can decolonise institutional racism. Ruth started as a Kiwi and then went off to Oz, where she is now an RMIT Vice-Chancellor's Fellow based in the School of Art and Design and Creative Practice ECP platform. She's a nurse, academic, and a community-engaged researcher in gender, race, health, and digital technologies. Her current research explores how artistic design and collaborative practices have the potential to empower people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds who experience health inequities. Mark is an Aboriginal Australian researcher who lives in Newcastle on the lands of the, I can't even say, I'm so sorry, Mark. We didn't practice this. Say again, sorry?
Awabakal people.
Thank you. He's founder of Commitix, a company dedicated to research and corporate governance. Mark is very research active, which involves mentoring, grant writing, article writing, and involvement in research governance committees. Thank you very much, guys, for speaking here, and welcome, Ruth. You're going to kick us off.
Thank you. And this is the fun part where I get to play with technology. So hopefully this will work and you'll be able to see my PowerPoint. How are we going? How's that, everybody? Good?
All good.
Kia ora tātou. So wonderful to be in conversation with the fabulous Mark Locke and Jacquie Kidd, and big mihi to Dan, who's behind the scenes here. Katanga te titi, katangi te kaka, katangi hoki aho. Let me begin by acknowledging the Bunwarang people of the Kulin Nations on whose ancestral land I stand. As an uninvited guest, I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I want to acknowledge all the Indigenous people who are watching this webinar. I pay tribute to the knowledge, strength and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I acknowledge the profound trauma of European invasion of their unceded lands. And I'd like to also acknowledge that mechanisms for healing and caring for each other's well-being in this place go back 80,000 years. Yet Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people face threats to their health and well-being on a daily basis, as seen in the removal of sacred trees, deaths in custody, and many more injustices. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to thank the organisers of this epic event, especially Heather Kame, Dan, Jeanette, and all the other folks who've been working so hard. And I chose this particular saying because I live right next to Phillip Island where sheer waters travel, and I'm surrounded by parrots here in South Gippsland. In the time of coronavirus, I also want to acknowledge all the Indigenous nations and peoples who've protected and continue to protect stolen lands. And I'm thinking of friends particularly like Tina Ngata, Ngāti Porou. So, folks, it's great to talk to you. The way that Mark and I thought this could work was that I'd do a little bit of background about cultural safety in Aotearoa and then how it's travelled to Australia. And I'm going to finish up sort of talking about some of the issues or questions or conversations, and Mark's going to segue beautifully into talking about governance and decolonising governance. Is that right, Mark?
Sounds good.
And Mark might also chip in. Luckily, Mark's brought the fire because I brought slides and Mark has slides too. Just wanted to say a little bit about myself. I come from Goa and I'm an uninvited guest on this land. And so one of the things I'm very interested in is what is the role of people of migrant backgrounds in the context of Indigenous sovereignty, and how do we collude in colonial practices? So that's something that's consumed me for a lot of my life. I moved to this beautiful part of the world. I showed everyone the background earlier. It's utterly beautiful, and if you can just imagine some very calm water and French island on the other side of the screen. I moved here to take up a role running the nursing program at Monash University, and this is just how utterly beautiful this land is. So I'm very, very conscious of whose land I'm walking on every day or surfing in. My background is as a nurse. This was me when I worked at National Women's Hospital. I look the same, don't I, Jackie? And one of the things that I'm also very, very interested in is the ways in which we can use social media to affect social change and health. So it's nice that I've connected with Mark via social media and reconnected with Jackie through Twitter again. And I guess one of the things that I found very interesting is how cultural safety has travelled to Australia, and this happened almost exactly a year ago. February 2018. What the hell is cultural safety? So what I'm going to do is give you a very quick overview about cultural safety, and some of you will know this already, but contextualize it a little bit in the sense that particularly talking about racism, and kind of there's been another kind of epidemic that lots of people have been talking about, which is callous indifference in healthcare. But I want to say a little bit about whiteness in nursing, history of cultural safety, and then how it's travelled to Australia. And I'm going to try and do that reasonably succinctly. So one of the things that we've been observing in health is there's been a loss of hope, and particularly in Western health systems where there's been more and more evidence of what the Francis report identified as callous indifference. So in the Francis report, they found all kinds of missed care, people left in soiled beds, water placed out of reach, inadequate support for people. We've also got research shows a decline of empathy in nursing students the longer they practice. We also know about horizontal violence. In Australia, we've had a Royal Commission into aged care, disability and mental health. We've had some really devastating stuff to deal with. And then also real concerns about the role of nurses in places like Manus and so forth. So neglect and missed care. And there's some questions about, well, is that failure to care actually embedded in the health system rather than being exceptional? So that's a question that I think is very interesting. And I know, Mark, you'll be connecting with that later on. So some of my favorite people like Nancy Krieger, have written about race and racism being determinants of health inequities. And, one of the things that I think is very interesting, particularly in Australia where I live now, is the kind of myths of racial harmony and multiculturalism and egalitarianism. But also the denial of racism and a real discomfort about even talking about it. And one of the things that I'm interested in, I'm sorry, my slide's a bit funny there, is racism isn't just out there, and I'm going to show you some media representations in a second. It's also enacted within the health system. It's not just this, the health system isn't a bubble that's separate from everything. And it was my fantasy that it would be this place of beauty and loving kindness ever since I was a student over 30 years ago. So I think that also the sort of dominant attitude of colour blindness, treating people the same, means that often we don't take into account people's different needs. So just to talk about the Australian context very briefly, one of the most devastating things that's happened in the last few years, and I know if there are Aboriginal people that are watching this, that they'll be aware of this and maybe also have a relationship with Nae. She's a Aboriginal woman who visited a New South Wales hospital 18 times, and the last time she visited hospital was given some paracetamol. She was treated really casually, and concerns were not taken seriously. She was stereotyped as someone who might be a drug user with mental health problems, and she actually died of meningitis neisseria, I think it's called, off the top of my head. So that's been devastating, and Mark also is going to pick up on some of the recommendations from that coroner's report later on. I've tried very hard to link to what I thought Mark might say. So, but the other thing that we also see is some devastating and callous disregard for people who are in offshore detention in Australia. And it's a model that's been transported to other parts of the world. In Aotearoa, there's this kind of illusion that there isn't racism. When I talk to Australian friends, it's like, oh, but New Zealand, Aotearoa is so much better. And here are some very devastating examples of ridicule in the media. One in terms of the measles epidemic, and the other in terms of public health that I wrote about a few years ago. And I guess, like I was saying before, the question about migrants and how they're implicated in these processes is something of great interest to me. And also how often the kind of agendas and aspirations for those groups of people, diverse as they are often used to divide us. I'm very grateful here for work by Paparangi Reid and Donna Cormack, a mate of mine, who just talks about the ways in which coloniality is reproduced continuously, and it's designed to deliver Indigenous inequity and white privilege unless it's purposely interrupted. And I think this is why Mark's work's so very, very important. We also know about white privilege in nursing. So, there's this kind of valuing of niceness. So often nursing elite is dominated by whiteness, and this is something that Hapati Ramsden and Margaret Southwick in New Zealand have talked about a lot. And also the history of nursing erases the leadership of Black and Indigenous nurses, and here I'm thinking also about the Nursing Now campaign, which sees Florence Nightingale as the be-all and end-all of nursing. And we see this also in terms of hiring and promotion practices, clinical practice, copying all kinds of everyday racism from patients, colleagues, administration, particularly around this coronavirus. So I'm thinking of Ria Lang, who's a Australian doctor who was from Aotearoa, who's had patients saying they don't want to be touched by her, or they don't want their children touched by her. So, so on the one hand, we've got this happening in nursing, and on the other, nurses have also been incredible innovators, and here's at Ahapiti Ramsden, who with other Māori nurses developed the concept of cultural safety. And for those who aren't very familiar with it, and I'm guessing most of you will be, it's a really exciting critique, and it's shaped in this location of settler colonialism that acknowledges what a profound determinant colonialism and the traces of colonialism and racism that are embedded in structures continue to have. And I think the most important thing about it is really that we have to know ourselves, and we have to see ourselves as culture bearers, and how that has an impact on how we care for people. And so much about power relations. I've got a point there about critical self-reflection, which I'm going to come back to later, because I kind of think it's really inadequate in the face of these neoliberal juggernaut health systems that we have nowadays. So very quickly, the first step, cultural awareness. Second step, cultural sensitivity. And then the third step is cultural safety. So in the awareness kind of zone, where we're kind of aware that someone's different from us. In the sensitivity zone, we're trying to sort of make some amendments and negotiations, and in cultural safety we completely reverse the gaze, and it's very consumer focused, and they decide whether they've experienced care as safe or not. And that consumer could be a whānau or a community, not just an individual. So very quickly talking about Aotearoa, back in '88, schools of nursing had to demonstrate their commitment to the Te Tiriti. 2002, I'm just going to hit the highlights. Cultural safety was separated from the Treaty of Waitangi and Māori health, and those guidelines have continued to be revised. Amidst all of this, there's been a lot of kind of interesting media and student backlash, which I won't go into here, but it's not been an unproblem. That's a double negative. It's been far from unproblematic being integrated and into educational settings. And there are lots of questions about whether it's actually been something that's gone beyond education settings to how people practice. In 2003, the Health Professionals Competency Assurance Act was introduced, and what I find very interesting is they use the word competence rather than safety as a hot potato. So the thing that's been really interesting about its development is it's expanded. So it's gone beyond Indigenous people to also include any kind of difference. It's travelled to other settler colonies and beyond, and then the implementation, and Mark will talk more about that, has been reduced, so it's primarily focused on First Nations in Australia. So very quickly, why cultural safety in nursing in Australia? Significant health disparities, very similar to Aotearoa in terms of life expectancy and all the risk health stats. And nurses, as the largest professional group in health, are in a great position to prepare really culturally safe practitioners. So in Australia, in 2018, where's my 2018 gone? It became introduced, and in 2020, there's now a cultural safety strategy, and I know you'll be saying more about that, Mark. We've also got a definition of cultural safety, which I'll share with you shortly. So in 2018, the Code of Conduct was developed. Massive backlash. And it came from this random fella who set up his own union, despite all the consultations throughout Australia. And basically, he got a lot of airtime by saying people would have to declare their white privilege. So that raised the hackles of a lot of people. What cultural safety meant was before you could respond to them, you'd have to declare that you're a privileged person. So this was a fabulous critique that happened on our Media Watch program. So it was a good way to wind people up. And the great thing is the Nursing and Midwifery Board said No, this is not true. So what I did in response to this, and because I've been working closely with the fabulous Janine Mohammed at Katsanam, a whole bunch of us wrote different things to support this. And for the first time in my life, I wrote a piece, but then I was also helped to make an infographic by Croakey and Mitchell Ward. And this infographic has been very, very popular. You can find it online if you're looking for it, but it seemed to, I was trying to look at how could I dispel the myths about cultural safety, but largely in terms of feelings rather than facts. So I tried to talk about the feelings because there are people who are feeling very fragile. The wonderful thing that happened is all the nursing organisations got behind cultural safety, and I think that's the beautiful thing that's happened in Australia. And I'm just aware I should just hurry up a little bit so that we've got time for Mark and questions. So one of the things I've been experimenting with is what are the ways that I can do my part, and how do we put it into practice given there's, it's a new concept in Australia. It's big, it's kind of wide open in a way that it isn't in Aotearoa. So I've been trying to sort of talk about it in different ways, trying to use different kinds of images, and I'm just showing you some ideas. One of the pedagogical issues is that we have low numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teaching staff at universities, and then low numbers of non-Indigenous staff with the knowledge and skills. So I created a cultural safety unit at a university that I will not name, but at one of the campuses where a colleague was supposed to be teaching it, they said, cultural safety, that's reverse racism, Ruth. So, if that's the starting point with colleagues of yours, then you know that your work's cut out for you. And by the way, this is the fabulous Vicky Cousins who reintroduced possum skin cloaks in Victoria and is a good mate. So just want to show you the definition. This is the proposed definition that Apprehend for cultural safety. And as you can see, it's very focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and people. And quite different from the Nursing New Zealand one, which I've just put here. So you can see it talks about age, generation, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. The national scheme and strategy were launched recently. And I guess I'm in the position where I'm really thinking about how effective is critical reflection, which is seen as a fundamental aspect of cultural safety. How do we do it, and what kind of work environments create spaces for that critical reflection to occur? These are the 4 critical aspects in the new strategy. Leave that there for a second so you can see that. These are all beautiful things. I'm interested in, how they'll be operationalized and supported. Mm-hmm. I've been doing this work at a community health organisation, a 2-year project looking at cultural safety and how we do it. And I guess this is a question that Mark and I are both interested in is, okay, we've got the definitions. How do we actually do it? How can we see that it's being done in powerful ways? One of the things that we did with CoHealth and Paper Giant, which are some designers I worked with, was we started trying to map out the different aspects and then how they could be implemented. So just to finish up, I guess I've got some questions really about how something that really is very much led by Indigenous nurses that had Te Tiriti as its basis in Kaua Whakaruruhau. Where are things at in Aotearoa? I'd love to know what people think. Has there been some good theory development? Is there broader support? Where do we go next? Who will lead it? How adequate is individual critical reflection? And then in Australia, with having an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander focus and being led and being supported broadly by nursing and midwifery organisations, is there potential to expand the scope so that it's more intersectional? So I'm going to hand over now to Mark, I think, or are we going to go to questions, Jackie?
Let's try again. We'll go to Mark first because he may well answer some of the questions that are coming up anyway. And just to reassure people who are going, I can't read fast enough, yes, you will have access to this again afterwards, so just chill. Over to you, Mark.
Great. Thanks very much, Ruth and Jackie, and thanks everyone for joining in. And all the questions looks wonderful. I'm a Nimpa man from born in Dubbo in New South Wales. I live in Awabakal country in Newcastle. And it's great to see every Indigenous person on this call, on this webinar, and interested in this topic. And I pay my respects to you and what you're dealing with in these difficult times in terms of COVID-19, but also in terms of dealing with questions about what is cultural safety and how to operationalise that concept into all the different ways that it can be. It's a lot of competition with cultural safety, I've noticed, because there's also in Australia cultural respect, cultural inclusiveness, cultural capability, cultural competence, and cultural sensitivity, and I call it the cultural concept soup. In fact, I've got now on a literature review 39 different cultural concepts in use in Australia, where culture is placed in front of some word like that. And so that you can tell there's a lot of anxiety about that with professionals. What are we talking about when we're talking about cultural safety, white power, white privilege, and how do we reflect on that when our reflections, how much can we engage with that individually and as a profession, and in our work roles and through the trajectory of our institutional life. So it's really, really complicated things to unpack and reflect on, and it's really challenging. I always start out saying to people, always talk about Hinarangi Mahi's words, which Ramsden writes about in a thesis about the Huey in 1988, I think, and talking about people talk about medical safety and physical safety, ethical safety and legal safety. What about cultural safety? And it's always a great way to start a conversation about it. And because in any organisation, I'm asked to go through the policies, the online training modules for bullying policy, racism policy, discrimination policy, occupational health and safety policy. So I go through all these online modules, and where's cultural safety? So that's how I think about looking at institutional racism, is thinking very deeply about how it could be embedded when we don't realise it. It's not like you can get a cup of institutional racism and pour it on someone's head or anything like that. It's an invisible thing that is just by habit at times embedded into organisational behaviour. And one of those habits that I like to unpack and interrogate is committees, and hence, my company is called Committee Analytics because I love researching committees, and that's really, really, it's really boring, but it's one way to think about, what does cultural safety look like, when institutional racism look like, when you're not dealing with a patient, when you're not a nurse talking with a patient, a doctor with a patient, a lawyer with a client. What does cultural safety look like in a committee? And there are thousands of committees and in a health system. Heather Kame knows this when she did the research about sites of institutional racism in policy discourse in New Zealand, and looking about the Maori people's participation in decision-making committees in the health system. So that's where I look at cultural safety. I'll share it with you a little bit of content, which will be shared online with you as well. This is my presentation. I won't take you through it, but just want to focus on to highlight that there's a trajectory here to the presentation. I look at governance and corporate governance, and there's lots of definitions around that. One of the things that I realised was that when I looked at the literature around corporate governance, lots of academics write and publish about corporate governance, but there was no Aboriginal voice in that literature. So our cultural voice was completely excluded from how to make a health system more efficient and effective. But what does that actually mean? And this is how I look at governance structures. I'll just zoom in on that. We talk about the health system. We talk about how is something like institutional racism embedded unintentionally in our system. What does the system look like? You can see here there's lots of committees in any organisation. There's lots of policy documents that organisations refer to, like Closing the Gap, like the National Health Reform Act, like the Australian Health Professional Regulation Standards. Lots of documents are part of the fabric of corporate governance. And part of that is all our acts. So how many acts do you think we have? A great piece of research called Legally Invisible. Some academics investigated 178 separate pieces of health legislation in Australian states and found that Aboriginal people were mentioned only 2 times explicitly in those health acts and regulations. So we're legally invisible in the very rules that structure our health system, structure our boards of governance, and structure how our organisations work. When you think about cultural safety and its relevance, think about all these pathways here and all these points. So points and pathways in governance. There's, in this schema, where is clinician-patient interaction? That is almost invisible in these kinds of, you probably see it in the operational plan, is where you get performance agreements and things like that for how clinicians engage with patients. But there's all these invisible processes, and I call it the white box of governance. So in the literature, there's a lot of talk about black boxes, and I try to invert that and go, well, I'm going to unpack the white box of government governance and see what's inside that box and how all these points and pathways, all these structures can unintentionally recreate racism and biases and discriminations. So I think, Ruth, how does that tie in with your thinking? Oh, can't hear you, Ruth. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was trying to discipline myself and not butt in. So, sorry, Mark. Can you say that again?
How does that kind of thinking? When you were talking about critical reflection, that was a particular concern for you at the moment. How does that, when you think about if you're in any of those points and pathways in the system, cultural safety can mean a lot of different things. So I write a lot of terms of reference for committees. I look at strategic plans and frameworks and things like that, and that's my business. That's how I embed cultural safety in there. In words and processes, and how does what's the New Zealand experience in terms of that?
I'm really glad you've said what you said, Mark, because I'm about to start a 3-year project where I try and look at ways of embedding it in health services, and I think embed is the key word from what you just said, Mark, because the concept of critical reflection, I think, was really appropriate for the 80s and 90s because we did have opportunities to sit together and kōrero, but I think the way the health system has kind of sped up, means that it's really difficult to have those moments where there are conversations. And so I actually think something architectural is more necessary, and factors in the environment that enable culturally safe behaviour. So I think embedding it is the way to go, because otherwise we're just depending on the individual kind of motivations of people rather than a collective effort. Like, I think if we have collective reflection, that's a whole different thing. But I think individual reflection is very difficult to do.
Can I just interrupt with a question that's come through from a couple of different people? Kia ora, Valence, nice to see you. How do we embed intent, and do you find that embedding it in the documentation actually changes the action?
Yeah, great question, and I'm examining that from different points of view. There's one thing to say, you can have lots of nice policy documents and great phrases and definitions, but what does it translate to in reality? And that's the task. Is we actually have no way. We don't have a database to measure, to track indicators. There's the literature that says in Australia we don't have an agreed definition of cultural safety. We have one definition for Australian health practitioners, and we have Robin Williams' definition outside of health, and we have multiple different definitions floating around in the discourse. So we've got multiple definitions, ambiguity with what is cultural safety. Is it about racism, white privilege, white power, decolonisation, power sharing, co-design? There's all those complicated concepts to deal with. And what has that got to do with someone who's who walks in and needs emergency care anyway? So we don't have a system set up to track what, if you say this in a policy, how does that track through to delivery? But we are getting there, because I can share this is, I'll share with you now. It's a good point. I'll just find the screen to share. That if you go to answer that question, my website here, you can see there, www.comedics.com. You can see that there's lots of projects there. If you go to the cultural safety page, projects page, you'll see that I keep up with this work, what's happening in this space. So I keep track of what's happening in governance. And if you go to my Facebook page about cultural safety, I think there's quite a few members online who are onto that. I post regularly about what's happening There's so much activity. This is what I was saying to Ruth. I focus on Australian literature and activities in cultural safety. It's really hard to keep up with the pace of change. It's absolutely phenomenal. And it's happening with regulations. It's happening with health service self-assessment tools for cultural safety. It's happening with cultural competence standards in health professional training. It's happening in the legal profession. It's happening in education. It's happening in social justice. So it's not just health. It's cultural safety is going in multiple places, and there's multiple activities, and it's actually really hard to make sense of at the moment. Right? Because it's a big wave, crest of a wave of activity rushing through. And like any wave, it's got to land, it's got to wash up on the shore, and then you've got to filter through the debris, I guess. Okay. Any other questions, Jacquie?
Let's have a look at this one from Kim. It's a long one. In the Australian context, I teach and advocate for cultural safety that speaks to intersectional identities. I'm also committed to cultural safety that acknowledges the distinct rights and responsibilities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and which takes into account colonisation, self-determination, the importance of Indigenous controlled health, and so on. I'm concerned that a tension is growing politically between an expanded intersectional cultural safety and Indigenous specific cultural safety. I would like a language and a politics that can accommodate a conversation that develops both lines of thought and perhaps develops a conversation between them. Any thoughts?
Mark, can I start on this one?
Yeah, great.
Kim, that's a terrific question, and I think Aotearoa's attempted to navigate that line by separating Māori health, Te Tiriti, and cultural safety. So cultural safety is like a broad concept, but then also feeds into those two other concepts. Jacquie, did you want to add to that at all? Because you were there in Aotearoa, and here I am in Australia, and things might have changed since I was there. But that's how I kind of see the separation. And I think what that does is it then doesn't dilute the sovereignty question.
I think so. I think I don't necessarily think we're all doing it brilliantly, but there is definitely an attempt to focus on Te Tiriti in order to answer Māori health inequities. And when we're talking about Māori health rights and self-determination, Te Tiriti is the basic document that we use. So I wouldn't like for a second to say that we're doing it well, but I think the intent is there, and it gives us the opportunity to at least talk about the difference between what other populations in New Zealand need in terms of cultural safety and what Māori are entitled to in terms of Te Tiriti. Does that make sense?
That's a good answer.
I think it's an important tension to acknowledge too. I've seen that in the literature where cultural safety is being taken up in multicultural research, culturally and cultural and linguistic diversity research. Quite a few articles now coming out in Australia talking about multiculturalism and communities and cultural safety as well. The tension, I think, is about the differences that, First Nations people with an 85,000-year history, and recent arrivals in the last, the Europeans and British arrivals, invasion and colonization, and then the waves of immigration, and then now people coming across voluntarily through visas. So there's multiple points of intersectionality there, and they are actually physically present in me. I'm an Aboriginal man. I'm Scottish convict as well. So I have ancestors who came across on the First Fleet, and almost also my Latvian heritage. But what defines my identity, how I cope with intersectionality, is my socialization is very strongly rooted in the First Nations experience here when I grew up in country Australia. They're my defining terms of reference, if you like, in my mind. I have no memories of anything about Scottish, Latvian or British ancestors like that. So that's how I deal with it. But in discourse, I'd like to see, I like using, excuse my pronunciation, kawa whakaruruhau. I'm trying to practice that more, because I think I'd like research to say, yes, I think cultural safety is relevant for you, but actually, what would you say to that? What would your what language would you use for that? Instead of me saying, I will use cultural safety on you, how was any nationality talk back to me and say, well, okay, I understand what you're saying, but from my point of view, I'm going to use this cultural term. And so I'd like to use kawa whakaruruhau in my writing, because that is Maori and I will never understand it. But I understand its interpretation into cultural safety because I read English. But I can't then pretend as an First Nations Australian to read cultural safety in English and know what it means for Maori people. So I take that point, trying to deal with intersectionality in that level as well. I hope that wasn't too complicated and long-winded.
Right. Playing with buttons, too much buttons. So Eddie Moore says cultural safety is key. How do we measure the cultural safety once participants have completed a cultural safety session? And that goes to what a lot of people are talking about in the chat, which is about accountability and how we build accountability also into our legislation and our policies. So that's one for both of you to tackle, I think.
I think one of the tricky things in the literature and in my own experience is that sometimes Hi, Eddie, I should say. Great question. One of the issues is that sometimes training can massively backfire and actually achieve the opposite of what we're hoping for. So that's why I'm interested in doing this 3-year research project, because I kind of think this is really complicated because, and I noticed one of the other questions is around the responsibility of people who are white, and I also say the people who are non-Indigenous, is, we can do work like read books about white fragility, about history, but I think the learning has to come from ourselves. We have to be motivated, and training that is compulsory for people, in my experience, massively backfires, and I've certainly been at the receiving end of it over the last 30 years.
I think it's really difficult to achieve accountability from cultural training programs. So in my research, if you type in cultural humility to Google, you will get 100,000 hits on cultural humility training. And same with all the cultural concept soup terms: cultural respect, cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness. But when I started looking at this, as an Aboriginal citizen, I wanted to know, for cultural safety training, what they were saying about me, because they didn't ask me when they formulated their training modules. And so I looked at all the commercial modules. First of all, I found as a citizen, I had to be a member of a professional association to have privileged access to their professional cultural safety modules. So as a citizen, I can't hold them to account for what's in their modules because it's behind a corporate paywall. And secondly, when I knew trainers developing those courses, the content is never shared with me for cultural validation. So as an academic, I develop surveys and research questions, and one of the my routine practice as an academic is to validate my thinking by yarning, by testing the materials, by testing the questions. I don't actually see that with cultural training whatsoever. So I came to the conclusion, once I looked at all the cultural training programs online and not being able to look at any of the training at all, is that the cultural training industry is a secret, private, confidential industry that means it disempowers me as an Aboriginal citizen to have a voice in the process. And I'm really offended by that. And so I want a standardization, a program to say, if you have a nurse practitioner regulation, and we've all got accreditation standards now, why can't the cultural training industry have a regulatory framework and have standards and have accountability mechanisms? Because currently there's nothing around that.
There's a couple of questions. There's one here from Kerry that I really want to ask shortly, but I know that Adrian has been jumping up and down on his seat because he's got a series of questions maybe about Ken Wyatt. How much influence is Ken Wyatt able to exercise in his role, and could he be regarded as embedded? I'm going to ask you, first of all, for the non-Australians, to explain a little bit about who Ken Wyatt is.
Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Commonwealth Minister, Liberal Party, and an Aboriginal man from New South Wales, although his electorate is in Western Australia. Yep. Is that good? Good enough?
So how much influence do you think he has, and would you regard him as being embedded?
I look at the history of Aboriginal politicians in Australian parliaments. They're politicians. They're one of the Liberal Party. How many Liberal Party members are there? 200, 140. There's one is a junior minister, not in the cabinet, so he's outside of that inner circle. One minister amongst hundreds in a parliament that has got 320 members anyway. So there's a lot of competition for what he's trying to do, and you can tell that that's a power kind of calculation that I'm doing. You go 1 out of 200, out of 320, out of a federal system. You can see that his power is diluted. And another part of that calculation is we have 250 nations, and he's a man from one nation, okay? So where's the woman's perspective? And we've got I can't remember her name, a woman, Aboriginal woman in Commonwealth now. But so, yeah, I think it's really difficult to track that influence and to understand how embedded is he. And they last 2 to 3 terms, and their influence, what I see in political party terms, because I examine all the governance documents, and as many of you probably know, you can get lots of political statements, but then they last for a soundbite, and they last for a day, and they're transferred in the media release. They're transferred into the preamble of a new strategy, the National Aboriginal Health Strategy, or the next strategy, or the next strategy, or the next strategy. And you look back after, I'm 51, I look back after 30 years of research. And so if I see a political statement now from any minister, I'm just like, okay, I can analyse the effect of that in 10 years' time. And right now I can honestly say that of all the Aboriginal ministers, I can't see a lasting change or embedded change. There's in the Constitution, for example, we're still legally invisible in all health regulations and acts, okay? The changes about cultural safety happen unenforceably as well. So it's very difficult to assess political influence, but I think it's minimal in the long term, because the people who are on the front liner all the time are us. I'm always here doing this research, and will be for 20 years, nurses, and we have a long lifespan, but politicians don't.
Thanks, Mark. I'm watching, like, Ruth's going like a crazy woman here, putting links up all through the chat, which is really awesome.
Oh, thanks, Ruth. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah,
I just put a link to your website, Mark.
Great, yeah.
A few other things I've written. And
the Facebook page is there as well.
Yeah, I was just going to find it when,
Yeah, there was a question about what was the Facebook page. So if
I'll just put the link up.
One of you could find that link.
I'll find the link and you can talk about it, Mark.
Yep. It's a group I started when I was, because how I hold people accountable is looking, because I'm not a bureaucrat, I'm not employed in a university. I'm in a kind of a powerful position in that way. I'm an outsider to everything. I've always been on the fringe. And you talk about, once I start talking about our research committees, then you might as well just walk away, because, what a weirdo is that? But then it allows me a certain power as a citizen. I really use my power and set up all these alerts. I write blogs, about my experiences with institutional racism and cultural safety, because I come across daily experiences in my research practice, and I want to write about that and share and say, oh, this is an interesting thing that happened to me today, and what do you think? So I share that way, and I also keep the Facebook page. I have set Google Scholar and Google News alerts. type in the search terms cultural safety or culturally safe, and you get the Google alerts in my Gmail account, and then those alerts can be anything from a newspaper clipping, a media release, a strategy, a new policy, and it can be Australian. You can restrict it to Australia only or your profession. And I just post about that on Facebook. So I write about what's coming into my feed, and then I add a bit of a critique about what's coming into my feed and what it might mean in terms of the rollout or the influence of cultural safety in Australia. So that's the reason for the Facebook page. It's a sharing page, sharing links, sharing ideas, and it's very critically focused as well. I'm really, really forthright about that.
That's awesome. Flies. Lynn Copplestone says, many years ago in the NHS UK, there was a program of engagement called QED. I was involved and it opened people up to sharing their ideas with the administration, and they were required to document feedback and acknowledge. Is there a program like this being used for cultural safety? And I just kind of want to add, do you think that would be a useful program to use for cultural safety in both countries?
Haven't heard anything like that. Ruth, have you heard any?
No. But I mean, I think there are all kinds of other ways in which that documentation is collected, but I don't know if that program you're talking about.
And just to underscore that I'm not aware of that, is Naomi Day's case. I know her as Naomi Williams, by the way. Ruth?
Sorry, I mean, it should be Naomi Williams. I was thinking of Tanya Day as well.
Yeah. Naomi Williams at Tumut 2016. So the New South Wales coroner did a report about her case. She was pregnant at 27 weeks pregnant. Terrible. So there's lots of media online. Just type in Naomi Williams, Aboriginal woman, and you'll get tens of thousands of hits. The coroner report's really instructive because she saw 18 in a period of, two years or 1 year? 18 health professionals, but it documents her case, her history of care, because it was over a 4-year period prior to that. She saw 47 different health professionals, and the coroners looked at as much submitted research from their notes. Their notes don't notice anything about her cultural needs. They're very Aboriginal cannabis user, Aboriginal marijuana, Aboriginal mental health problems. Nothing about the history of colonisation, the history of her Wiradjuri country, any notes about that, reflecting on her cultural context. And this is in a health system where people have been doing cultural awareness training for 30 years, who've been doing cultural competence training for 20, and now we're doing cultural safety training. And we still have no, from the coroner's report, right, I don't have first-hand accounts of medical notes or nurses' notes or anything like that, but the coroner's report just picked out the medical, clinical stuff, and her cultural context was invisible in that. So from that, I can say there's probably no case notes, reflective notes about cultural safety as a routine practice.
I've got a summary of those notes here, but basically the failures were systemic. So 18 times in 7 months, every single, it wasn't just one or two people. It was just this massive systemic failure. And I think for me, that's the value of cultural safety at this time, as we've been talking, is that there's just massive potential to transform the health system. And like Mark's been saying, we've had a lot of different language in Australia, and I think I've shared a link with all the different terms that have been used. Because when I first came, I was trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? And we don't seem to have a common language. And I think there have been so many systemic failures, both in health and in the justice or injustice system, that the time is right for a really broad application of cultural safety in more than one sector, Mark, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. It's spreading through lots of sectors.
So I'm aware that we're about to finish. Jennifer R. asks something that I don't think either of you are going to be able to answer, which is the Aotearoa Māori nursing perspectives around kaua whakaru and where we need to go. So I just want to add my 2 cents and go pay parity would be a really good place to start. On that note, though, is there anything that you guys would like to add just as we finish?
I think you nailed it, but you know, there's good people writing. I know there's a thesis about to come out that kind of says, hey, because we've got the word cultural safety in Aotearoa, it's kind of like people think the work is done, you know. So I think that this work must continue.
Yeah, I think I agree. The work must continue on multiple levels, in multiple ways. And I'd like to see a consolidated effort, a multinational effort to think about what is a strategic research agenda for cultural safety. What does it look like in different places? How do we measure it? How do we define it? How do we monitor it? And how do we implement it and systematically evaluate it and hold people accountable?
Absolutely.
Sounds like I'm dreaming, I think.
I feel like there's more hope now than there has been for a while. I feel like maybe we're hitting some kind of critical mass where real change can happen. And I see somebody's jumped in there and gone, dreams are critical. Yep, dreams are free, dreams are critical, but we're working on it. So I'm going to call a halt there. We're just 1 minute after, so I want to congratulate you both on your impeccable timing.
Thank you.
And thank you so much to everybody who's joined in. We've had a couple of hundred people online. The comments have been amazing, and lots of people offering their own perspectives on how we move and what the work is that they're doing in this space as well. I really want to thank Dan, who's behind. He's the person behind the logo. Who lined us all up beforehand, and Community Research for their support, and all the volunteers that have worked with this absolutely epic event all the way through. I want to remind you guys that it's not over, that we've still got right through until Monday. So there's seminar sessions tomorrow, Sunday and Monday. This recording will be available via YouTube and the website. That you can find the Facebook page just by searching in Facebook Decol 2020. And I will just close us off with a karakia. Right.
Thank you.
Kia tau te rangi Māori e, o te rangi e tui honei, o te papatūnuku e takato nei, o te taiao e awhi nei, ki runga i a tātou, tihei Māori ora. Kia ora everyone, thank you very much.